to introduce the next panel, which is the rise of fake news in the age of polarization. We're very lucky to have with us today two extraordinary panelists. KRISTINA WILFORE brings a mastery of virtually all aspects of politics and grassroots organizing to KARAKOYUN strategies with over 20 years of experience in campaigns and elections, policy development, and civic advocacy. KRISTINA is a global change agent, helping to create a more vibrant and accountable democracy worldwide. Peter Pomerantsev is a visiting senior fellow at the Institute of Global Affairs at the London School of Economics, an author and TV producer. He specializes in propaganda and media development and has testified on the challenges of the information war to the US House Foreign Affairs Committee, US Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the UK Parliament Defence Select Committee. Please join me in welcoming our panelists today.
I promise I have not put myself on every panel. It just worked out in the order. So let me put some structure to this conversation. This will be a whiplash version of a presentation, but we want to get right into some of the main issues. So when we look at the phenomenon of fake news, we really have to ask ourselves, what exactly are we talking about? Especially as one president of a country, you may notice, calls everything fake news. So the definitional aspects of what we're really dealing with are a little bit clouded or politicized, to say the least. But what it is in fact news articles that are factually incorrect, parodies and sarcasm, hoaxes, memes, online abuse, a variety of things that fall into the larger bucket of fake news. I think it's very important for us, especially as we design remedies, to figure out what exactly we're talking about and who is the perpetrator. So if we take this kind of approach where you have long-standing informational campaigns that have always been a part of countries like North Korea, Cambodia, Russia, China, trying to mislead either internally or externally about foreign affairs or domestic news. Then you have false news, just things that are wrong. The news has gotten it wrong. Then you have now these two categories that I would put particular emphasis on, which is false amplifiers and the disinformation campaigns. So this is where we have coordinated activity by inauthentic accounts of people who don't exist, and one country in particular, as we're seeing, pushing a lot of it in the US election, to alter political discussions and really to manipulate information that is from the agenda of malicious intent. So I think it's really important to be very specific in how we look at these different categories. What's new about this conversation? What's new is that we're seeing it have a direct impact on campaigns. It is not only on the rise, but is more impactful in particular campaigns, and not only that, post-campaigns, which I'll talk about for a second. And it's the amplifier effect of social media. We would not be having the same conversation 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, if it wasn't for the platforms that exist that allow for this amplification of false, misleading information. And not only just the main accounts like Facebook and Twitter, but now even PayPal, how they were in fact opening up accounts for organizing and fundraising of events that had no real individual and no legitimacy behind them. But the other aspect of what's new is distrust. We are able to have a conversation about the impact of fake news in light of polarization, because it is the polarized environment that lets fake news breed and be more effective. And the point of those who are perpetrating this is really to create internal chaos and make Western democracies fight among themselves so that we can't hold other countries accountable when it comes to their agenda or adherence to democratic principles. And so this is the real root of what we're dealing with here. I want to highlight some of the high-profile fake news that we know as a result of investigations in the US related to the Internet Research Agency. So there was 13 indictments specifically of the Internet Research Agency and individuals. This is a St. Petersburg-based entity since 2013 that's been churning out fake news, Facebook posts, Twitter accounts. They've employed hundreds of people specifically to use any opportunity to criticize Hillary and the rest, except Sanders and Trump. We support them. This was the agenda. And what we saw on it were 429 false Facebook accounts, online personas, stealing of identities, over 2,700 fake Twitter accounts. And now what we have is the real linkages between these. And I encourage you to read the actual indictment that shows you what the trail is. You have the Tennessee Republican Party's Twitter feed that was co-opted, who had more followers than the actual Tennessee Republican Party with 100,000. And many of the false information anti-Trump crowd versus pro-Trump crowd, for example, originated there, as well as on Tumblr, as well as on Reddit. So sourcing information, then bringing it back to Twitter. And the Twitter strategy was really about influencers. So could they get high-level celebrities, pro-Trump celebrities, to retweet this information, legitimize it, and make it go viral? Blacktivist. We have a legitimate organization fighting for racial justice called Black Lives Matter. Now, what you had Russians do is create this Blacktivist faux organization specifically to amplify racial tensions during the election. They had incredible following on Facebook, on Twitter, and then with this kind of content. So trying to blur the message and trying to create tensions. You have anti-immigration campaigns that were also identified as part of this Internet Research Agency through what's called secure borders, feeding this anti-immigration, anti-refugee sentiment. Very viral, went in many different places. And not just in the US, now we have the linkages specifically to European campaigns. Many of you are fighting this on the ground. We have fake news being a factor in Italy's recent election. In Austria, you had the chancellor who was also working with a campaign that was paying for and putting out fake information. And you have a very specific strategy in countries where it's not just about disinformation, it's about attacking political leaders like Macron in France and trying to make him less credible, character assassinations. And in the Nordic states in particular, the West is in moral decline is the focus of much of their information. So for example, there's an animal brothel in Denmark. And then they feed that information particularly back to Eastern European campaigns and countries that are looking at the EU. And they use this as a wedge. You also had an incredible amount of information, not just pre-Brexit, but post-Brexit, trying to tweet with these anti-Muslim messages and this Islamic phobia and trying to spur this into the political dialogue. So that's sort of the landscape. It's very, I would say, scary in what we're facing and how to really respond to this. But how do we respond? Here are some initial thoughts about that. One is we really have to have the digital footprint. We need to have the audit of how these different mechanisms are working. We need to expose and freeze Kremlin-linked dirty money. We need to make it more difficult for foreign shell money to move. I mean, this is how media companies, traditional media companies, were regulated. In the US, we have requirements in which you have to source the financial donors. You have to have transparency and exposure about how ads are being paid for. Social media platforms go unregulated in this way. And particularly, I think, problematic is that the CEOs of these media platforms have denied their culpability and do not have a sense of what is going on. And you had Mark Zuckerberg, for example, after the election, even say that it would be crazy that Facebook could have influenced the election. So there's an utter lack of accountability among those who are sourcing much of the root of fake news. You had Germany take a move to do Twitter blocking. You have interruption campaigns, which I'll highlight in a second. And I do think we need professional advertising and communication to really counter this and get to the root of it. In Ukraine, you have a platform called Stop Fake. Now, Ukraine was the root root of much of what Russia is doing in other countries, they use the invasion of a sovereign country and trying to change the narrative about that as a testing ground for what we're seeing in other countries. And so you have Ukraine, who has responded with platforms like this, where they're using investigative journalism to really look at these stories and put out information that people can believe. In Africa also, you have a lot of misinformation, and you have organizations like Africa Check, who are another sort of source of how we can correct this. I think we also need, and Sweden has led the charge in this, media literacy. And so the How to Stop Fake News, in teaching individuals at a young age how to be critical thinkers and discern what they see online. I want to show two ads, and then we will bring it over to Peter. In Kenya election I've been heavily involved in, we had lots of disinformation based on false voting information, but some of it was put out by candidates to either increase distrust in the election or to increase and invalidate votes. And so here's two examples of how we responded. This first one was the issue that the voter registry was full of dead voters, and that those voters would be able to vote and the election would be stolen.
You may have heard people say that dead voters can vote, but can this really happen? There are many provisions that prevent voter fraud. Voters have to show up in person and will be identified using their fingerprints. No two people have the same fingerprints. Voters will have to show their original ID that they registered with. Voters cannot vote more than once. The KEEMS device checks you off once you have voted and your finger is inked. Observers and agents are watching. You cannot impersonate as another voter. This is an electoral offense.
One more ad, and it seems sort of silly, even dead voters can't vote. We put out an ad from this, but we can't dismiss these issues. We have to equally communicate and as aggressively to correct the misinformation rather than just think it will go away on its own. We'll play the last ad. And this had to do with the voting process and technology itself. So my last point will be the both long-term and short-term solutions that we need really have to be carefully constructed, because we also don't want to be undemocratic in the way that we provide some structure, some control, some influence over this. And so it is, I think, one of the most important questions in how we manage this environment coming forward. And I'd love to work with many of you in some of the designing some of the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. And now we'll hand the floor over to Peter for his thoughts.
Right. I'm going to explore, I suppose, sort of the background to some of what has already been talked about. And I want to look at two aspects. I think there's a reason that we talk so much about fake news, disinformation, misinformation, all these various terms which have become so prevalent in our discourse and which seems to be flooding our information space. One of those reasons is technological, the other one is cultural. And I want to sort of put forward two ideas about why we live in such a strange era. And then maybe we can think about how to solve it when we start to deal with some of these questions. The first one is the technical side. I want you to consider and ask yourself a very serious question. Why are there so many kittens on social media? Everywhere you go on social media, there are bloody kittens. ISIS have a feed of ISIS guys with kittens. Where has this kittens phenomenon come from? If we understand this, we will understand the crisis of our times. So there's a guy at the University of Venice who, if you don't know, you should be working with. A guy called Dr. Walter. I love his name, it's so confectionery. Quattrociocchi. It sounds like an ice cream. So Walter, if you don't know his work, he's Mr. Echo Chambers. He's the guy who, for the World Economic Forum, produces all these papers about misinformation and the nature of what we've called here today polarized communities. And he has a theory about kittens. It's just a theory, it's not scientific, it's a way of trying to understand the kittens phenomenon. So his theory is the following. It's based on 4 or 5 years of analysing what he calls the emotional dynamics in online communities, in polarised echo chambers, if you will. And basically, when looking at these communities, he found that people's emotions always went from positive to negative, always from quite calm to more and more extreme. And his theory is the following. We go online not to have an evidence-driven, Habermasian, rational debate where you try to win with carefully crafted factual arguments. We go online to feel good about ourselves. Yeah? We want confirmation bias of our prejudices. We want a little ego rush, which is returned in the form of clicks and likes and shares. But like any other egotistic desire, it's never quite fulfilled. Yeah, it's never quite enough. So you have to become more radicalized, more polarized, more aggressive in the points that you're trying to make. I think the official phrasing is like discourse in echo chambers tends towards polarization. I think that's the language he uses for Quattrociocchi. And because that can never be satisfied, yeah, we're always taking sort of more and more extreme examples, more and more often disinformation in order to prove our points. Because we're not trying to win a debate, we're just trying to make loud, ego-driven arguments. And because it can never be satisfied, the only thing that can satisfy it is the sight of something small and helpless, something that awakens a sense of power in us. So therefore something like a kitten. And for a moment, our narcissism is relaxed and we feel good about ourselves. So kittens kind of smooth the anger and the polarization of the internet. They're like a morphine shot for a heroin addict. But this is a serious thing going on beneath all this stuff about kittens, and I'm talking about fake news is not a cause of the problems in our public sphere. Fake news is a product of the technology that we're using. I don't want to over-romanticize the old kind of BBC newspaper sort of public sphere, but at least there was an aspiration towards having an evidence-driven debate which you had to win to a neutral audience. You had to beat them in an argument. You don't have to do that anymore. Yeah? You're just trying to fire up your polarized echo chamber. So again, so fake news is not a cause, it's a product. Yeah? So that's point number one, and that's the technical side. And the other one is kind of more a cultural problem. I mean, the opposite of fake news is facts. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. That's kind of the drama that we're discussing. Facts are not very nice things. You know, why would you want facts? Facts tell you you're going to die. No? That's the number one fact, once you recognize the facts. Facts tell you that you're nothing as rich as you want to be. You're nothing as good looking as you want to be. Facts are not pleasant. Yeah? Why would anybody want facts? But facts are useful. Yeah? That's why we want them. When you're talking about building bridges, you don't have a fact-free debate. You suddenly have a very, focused, evidence-driven debate about how you're going to build the bridge. Yes, so facts are useful if you're trying to build something. But something very strange has happened in our cultural sphere. And I was quite young when the Cold War ended, but I still have some sort of memory of both sides, both trying to compete in a fact-driven environment. The communists were trying to prove, often with fake facts, that their version of utopia was right. And obviously the democratic capitalists were as well. And I think back at that point in our cultural history, both sides were involved in a perverse but somehow rooted enlightenment debate about which model of the future would win. So facts were necessary to prove that you were winning. Think about the ridiculous Soviet institutes which tried to prove that the Soviet economy was actually progressive. Nowadays, neither side seems to really need facts in their discourse anymore. On the one hand, you have sort of Vladimir Putin reveling in international interviews, and he sort of goes, there are no Russian soldiers in Crimea, when everyone knows there are. So he's not lying, He's actually provoking us. He's saying, I lie, well, you lie too. There are no truth, there is no facts, there's just manipulation. We're the same. And of course, in America, you have a president who, he's not lying, he's reveling in the anarchic, almost libidinal casting off of any kind of rational discourse, because there's a joy of being defactual, or post-factual, or post-truth. In Britain, we have several very similar politicians who also, they revel in the fact that they're lying, because there's some sort of anarchic carnivalesque joy in that. That's the pleasure that we take in their discourse. So this is the second sort of cultural point that I'm trying to get to, that because we've lost any kind of ideologies that seem to seek a clearer model of the future, there is no space for a factual discourse within society. I'll end with a couple of examples from Poland and Hungary, which I think crystallize it. As long as Poland and Hungary had a very simple plan for the future, entering the European Union, they had a more or less fact-driven debate. You had to prove that you were doing these simple reforms in order, or actually very burdensome reforms, to get into the European Union. And you could build your political discourse around that. After they got in, and there was no more future to head to, they kind of found themselves in the situation of Russia or America after the Cold War. What the hell do we do now? And instead you have a taking over of a wild, conspiracy-driven, and of course nostalgia-driven discourse, because that's what unites all the sort of post-factual politicians that we talk about. They're all nostalgists, because there is no idea of the future which would need a factual discursive support. So a technical problem, the model of the media we use, and a much deeper historical cultural problem, the disappearance of an idea of the future, which necessitated a fact-driven discourse. I think those are two of the underlying issues that we face, but before we despair, we've created a new think tank at the LSE which is going to deal with all of this. And basically what we try to do is bring together data people and journalists, bring together the two people on different sides of this equation to think about how we get over these challenges. How do we, A, understand polarized echo chambers better, so we can understand why people are consuming fake news, how, understanding them better, we can deliver them better information. And also, thus, sort of generating, how do we generate a conversation about the future, whether through constructive news or other such mechanisms, which will generate a fact-driven debate? How do we create the arena for a fact-driven debate? So just as a last example, a project we just started in Italy, working with Corriere della Sera and the University of Venice. We're going to look at the debate around migration, which is one of the most contentious topics in Italy. Look at the different narratives and echo chambers around it. And then Corriere are going to spend a year, Corriere della Sera is a big newspaper in Italy, going to spend a year writing about migration in different ways, trying to see how they can understand their audiences so well that they can start inspiring them to have a fact-driven and more informed debate.
Thank you very much. We'll allow a few minutes for questions, even though we're running over time. We're doing that. We're going to go with 10 minutes for questions. I just want to say first that if somebody hasn't already tweeted, kittens are like the morphine shot for a heroin addict, I'm going to be very disappointed. Quote of the day. Okay, sorry, open to questions.
Okay. Thanks. I think that what you both said is really relevant. One thing, I just want to go right to what I'm interested in that I didn't hear a ton about, though you both tangentially mentioned it. Trust in media, traditional media, is low right now. So, you know, the media does a fair job making things worse, traditional media, I believe. Legitimizing, it's not just influencers that are doing that, traditional news, you have fake news and you have real news, but real news is often not better. They sensationalize stories, they're irresponsibly reporting on things, they're overblowing things that are happening on social media as real when they're not. So, you know, we're political consultants and we work in campaign speed. We don't have time to wait for trust in these sources to be restored. Certainly trust in politicians is not better. It's easy to come at someone on a social network in particular with a story that's coming from their friends and family or a source they haven't heard of and have them believe in it. So I'm wondering, in your opinion, you know, in a time when traditional media is so discredited and really local media is the only thing that maintains levels of trust in many countries, especially in the US, what role does media have in this, traditional media? You said you were working with journalists, but you know, what role do they have now? way to try and regain trust from people who really look at them and they're going for objectivity, and then they get this opinionated, very biased, form of reporting from these mainstream media sources.
That's such a good question, and one that we partly set up our institute to look at, actually. So, I don't know, have you ever been sent to these god-awful corporate bonding events? They send you off for a weekend to do stuff so that you trust each other. We only know one way of generating trust, which is to get people to do things together, and in that process, they learn to trust each other. Now, I don't think citizen journalism is the answer. I think that's a bit of a joke. But I do think media need to start to become relevant to people's lives. Flint, Michigan story, The New Yorker, massive trust towards that story in Flint, Michigan, though normally Flint, Michigan is not a place where they care about The New Yorker. Because they felt, oh my God, somebody actually took an interest in us and is doing something to change a situation now it's happening. Now that's very challenging for the old model of objective public broadcasting. We are above events. I work a lot in the Balkans, in Ukraine, where we're trying to generate those forms of media. That doesn't work anymore, because there's so many voices out there, people don't believe the public broadcasting objective voice as something outside of a mass of influences. So the future might actually be almost, which is very counterintuitive, almost an activist type media. It is getting inside people's lives and helping them actually achieve change. Now that's easy for us to say, very hard for journalists who have prided themselves on being objective above events, a sort of, Deus Ex Machina coming down, or not coming down, and sort of like giving their opinions on things. So I think that's the future. That's certainly what I'm seeing in countries where this crisis is even worse than in Europe. So I'm seeing that in the Balkans, in Ukraine, and I'm seeing little flourishes of that in the US, though I think the US has a long way to go down before it starts to come up with that.
Let me just add too, is we can't also forget the long-term solutions that we are absolutely are necessary in order to create an environment in which information can be shared. So it is media reform. It is looking at ownership issues. It's what we do in many countries to teach and work with journalists. So we can't also just ignore those, but that's the long-term track, of course, and won't give us the immediate. I would also say, if we look at the U.S., there is a bolstered investigative journalism going on right now as a result of Trump. And you see some non-traditional media sources leading the charge, whether that's BuzzFeed or a variety of those kind of outlets. And that is hitting a target audience of those who may not open up the New York Times, but they're interested in and believe that those sources have credibility. So I think that we'll see some new forms of this rise up that compensate to some degree.
Thank you. Other questions?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Ivana Maric. I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina. I just wanted to see you all. We have election in October this year, and fake news is going to be a huge topic. And we also have this project, as you, Kristina, said, Facebook pages and so on, to reveal fake news and so on. We also have investigated journalism, and it's all supported by international community. None of our government would support such a project. And I'm questioning, is it really effective, those kind of pages or to fake news, or is it helping to also to broaden fake news? I once tried with this some kind of experiment. I put there is I don't know if you see a picture of a man glued to the pillar, and they said in Brazil they are glue politicians that are corrupt on the pillar, and they let them stay there for a few days. And actually it's a guerrilla campaign, propaganda campaign, actually campaign for one bank. They just put it like this to get people to come to him, and he will then make marketing for his bank. And I put it on my Facebook. I said, look, this is a fake news. This is not corruption in Brazil. They are not punishing their politicians like that. And all comments was, yeah, that's good. We should do the same thing. We should put them on a pillar. I mean, no, it's a fake news. It's just, I just helped to run this fake news. How effective it is really in practice if you have an any idea about that. Thank you.
Go for it.
This is exactly what I've dealt with in many places. You don't want to further perpetuate these. We still have to get into the inner circle of those who are being influenced by fake news. And it's not us necessarily, right? So it's their friends and family. And unfortunately, some of what Facebook has proposed, the Explore option that they were testing out, where you get more information in your algorithm and your feed from friends and families, has proven to actually just perpetuate fake news. But I think we also have to recognize we're not the sources of the correcting disinformation. We have to figure out who is influential with those that are susceptible to that fake news.
Thank you very much. I think we've run out of time for this session.